Hello everybody and welcome back to Mastering Avantra. Today's topic is all about system hardening. What settings, what should you be looking at to really harden your system within your environment, and what is the best way to set it up? I'm not going to go through everything you could possibly do, but I'm going to give you a glimpse into the tools, the documents, and some of the more easily accessible features that you should be looking at as part of your system hardening. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to show you is the system hardening guide. So for any of you who have used our systems before, and if you're watching this video, I assume you are, you're well familiar with our support portal. And this is the homepage of our support portal. Here you will find access to our knowledge base, which has everything from specific scenarios right through to the system hardening guide. Now you can find it under security here, or if you just do a search at the top, you'll find it quite easily. But you'll find it's the main document underneath security called Avantra Hardening Guide. Now, I really strongly encourage you to bookmark this or, put some recurring time in your calendar once every 3 or 6 months to come back and review this, because it is a living document. It's something that we keep up to date as features change, as new settings are introduced, or as new advisories are released by us on how you should be running your Avantra environment. So in here you will find a host of recommendations across the Avantra master server and user interface, the agents themselves as you have them deployed in your network, as well as network communications and how to approach external access. There's a lot of detail in here, and I really encourage you to either read it yourself, pass it on to your security teams, or just make sure somebody is going through this fairly regularly to ensure you're running the best possible setup for your Avantra system. So I want to show a few things as we go through here. I'm going to pop over to my Avantra system that I have over here. And there's a few things I would show off here. The first thing is, this is your standard Avantra login page. Now, for a lot of you, and we know this because you interact with us through support or just from conversations, you typically hook your Avantra system up to a third-party identity provider. It might be SAML, it might be Active Directory, doesn't matter. And that's a fantastic way of ensuring your joiners, movers, leavers process is integrated into your Avantra environment. And we really strongly recommend going down this route. It really simplifies your user administration. But there's a couple of things that are different about my logon screen as opposed to, let's say, a default installed one. So for example, you don't see a forgot password link. And you also don't see the checkbox that says remember me. These are two things that can be easily disabled within your Avantra installation. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to point that out. The second thing we'll look at on the login page here is this little padlock here. Now I'm running Google Chrome, or any Chromium browser would show something similar. But if you click this, you get information about your connection to the Avantra server itself. So I'm nice green, padlock, connection is secure. The first thing I've done is I have replaced the X509 certificate that is presented by my Avantra UI. And I've replaced it with one that is signed internally by my own certificate authority so that my browser knows to trust this particular website. By default, we deliver Avantra with a standard placeholder certificate, but we really encourage you to replace this with your own certificate. By definition, the fact that I'm showing you the certificate means I'm connecting to my Avantra system using a secure port. Now, this is something, again, you can configure during your install or after the fact. Let me quickly show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to pop over to the Avantra system itself. So this is, as you can see, if I do hostname, you can see that I am logged into that Avantra server I showed you a few minutes ago at the OS level. Now I'm showing you, I think this is a Red Hat installation. Look, everything here I'm about to show you is common across every Linux installation and even Windows as well. At the end of the day, everything I'm showing you is capable of being done on a Windows system, on a SUSE system. It doesn't matter. So you might have to tweak some of the commands I'm showing or some of the stuff that I'm doing, but it should all be fairly common amongst installations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to log in as the service user I use to run Avantra. And I'm going to go to the Xangui installation directory. So Xangui is the code name for the underlying UI web server that we use to run the web interface. So I'm going to go straight into the configuration directory. And if I do an ls, you'll see there's a few things in here but what I want to show you here is the zangui.config file. Now, again, going back to our support website, support.avantra.com, you will find a detailed knowledge base article which shows you all of the options you could configure in this file. But there's a few things I want to show off. The first one is I have defined the SSL, so the secure port for connecting to the server, to be 8443. First of all, make sure you're defining this because it's good to connect and it's great to connect using a secure method. The second thing is I'm using what's called an unprivileged port. So if I set that to 443, which is an absolutely fine and standard port, the operating system would require extra permissions to run Avantra because it's saying, you're using a reserved privileged port. You must have the permissions to do so. And there's no need in my particular instance. It's all down to your own configuration, but I have no need to specifically use 443. So I use 8443, which is quite common in the industry. The second thing is I have disabled the insecure port. So again, you'll see the hash in front of it or the pound sign, depending on where you are in the world. I have disabled the insecure port. Now, if you have an existing Avantra installation and you've been using that port for a while, you may want to leave it enabled, but then add this line, which is redirect HTTP to HTTPS. So that's useful if you're going through a transition where you're like, hey, we installed this a few years ago. We were using a reverse proxy in front of it. We were fine using HTTP. It was all behind VPN. Perhaps that has now changed and you want to move over to HTTPS. This is a nice setting to allow you to do that gracefully. So anybody with a bookmark is going to be bounced right over to the secure port, and that's quite useful. The two last things I would show off here, and please nobody Twitter DM me on the password. I know that's a very bad password. It's just for the purposes of demo here. But the key store, the Java key store is where we keep all the information about this X509 certificate, so the public and the private key, and also the certificate chain. There's an entire Mastering Avantra video on how to replace this certificate and how to configure that, and I strongly encourage you to watch that if you want to see more about it. But these two lines here, first of all, we tell Avantra, here is the location of the key store, and the other one is the password for that key store. So once you've defined, hey, here's the secure port I want to use, here is the key store location with the certificate, and here's the password for the key store. I've disabled my insecure port, and if I did need to have it enabled, I could redirect the insecure to the secure. That's a great configuration for your Avantra UI. The second thing I want to show you in here before I leave the server itself is, let me quickly go down to my own user. So I'm logged in here as Bro, B-R-O, in this system, and I'm going to just go to, so I'm in my home directory in home bro. I want to go to the /opt directory. Now I have two things in here. I have the Avantra installation folder. I also have my Postgres installation folder with all my Postgres SQL data. What you'll notice here, if I do an ls-la, is I have no permissions on the Avantra installation directory. It is owned by the user Avantra, imaginatively named, and it is group membership for the group called Avantra. But I am not in that group. So if I try to go into the Avantra folder, I get permission denied. And that's just good hygiene when it comes to the installation of your Avantra system. Look, nobody else, unless you want them to, needs to have access to the installation files, to the configuration files like the one we just looked at. So why would you leave the access for them? And one of the things that is covered in the hardening guide, if I pop back over here, if you go down here, there is a whole section around restrict permissions on Avantra files, which gives you some example commands. And really, you only, if another service needs to have access, perhaps you want to monitor logs remotely by another system or something like that, then give them group access, give them group read access to specific folders or files. You don't need to have lots of people having access to those files. So they're the main things I wanted to show at the operating system level. Why don't we go ahead and actually log into the Avantra system now? So I'm going to log in using my credentials, sign in, and I'm in a standard Avantra installation running 2011.6, which is the latest at the time of recording. And most of the settings you would be changing based on our hardening guide, you can find under administration and settings, funnily enough. Now, I'm going to point out a few as I go down through. I'm not doing them in any particular order to match the hardening guide, because the hardening guide, as I said at the top, goes through a lot of stuff. Some of which is, just basic practices of how you approach things. Some of it is actual settings. So it's not specifically matching that in order. But let me show you a few things. So you've two sections that are really of interest. You've the Avantra Master Service, and then you've the Avantra UI Service. They are very different things, obviously, and so they each have their own sets of settings. So just be aware of that. If you change something in one, you may also need to change it in the other. So the first thing I would point out here is you have this global log level. So Avantra has 6 log levels available to you by default. And I think it's delivered as information, as the standard setting, but that may be not necessary if you're not in the middle of a support case or something like that. So one of the recommendations we make is, look, just put it to error. So only errors are outputted to your log files. Because if you went to trace, for example, you get a lot of information building up on those log files. Not only would that obviously cost you space, but also you don't need to be outputting that data. So in a hardening environment or hardened environment, just put it to error. That's all you want to see anyway. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would showcase down here is network.master.UI protocol. So quite a lot of our customers deploy their master server and their UI server on the same box. So the communication between the UI and the master happens within that installation, and it's all internal to the system, and it's fine. And in that situation, we deliver Avantra using the A5 protocol. When I say A5 here, this is just HTTP. Okay, so it's just plain text communication between the UI and the master, all within the same server. If that concerns you, or if you decide in the unusual scenario to split out your master from your UI, we highly recommend switching this to A5S, which is the HTTPS equivalent in that communication. So that's one of the hardening items we really encourage customers to have a look at, which is switch this to A5S. In a similar vein, you also have network TLS Cipher and network enabled client protocols. This is where you want to decide what Cipher suites you want to support with your Avantra communications. By default, we can support everything, TLS 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. I've switched mine here to TLS version 1.2 as a minimum. You may want to check the Java runtime environment that's installed on your system to see what Cipher suites are supported by that runtime environment. So for example, some versions of JRE 8 don't support TLS version 1.3. The version I'm running defaults to 1.2, so I decided to set mine to a minimum version of TLS version 1.2. So that's something else you want to have a quick look at as well. If I go down, the next two I want to draw attention to are these two here. So enable OS code exec and run.js allow DB write. So by default, your Avantra system is designed to manage your entire SAP and non-SAP landscape. That can include stuff like, for example, automated OS patching or running automations in general. And this is an incredibly powerful feature. As our CTO Bernd always says to me, with great power comes great responsibility. And so if you're able to execute commands on remote systems to achieve automations, that's an amazing feature, but it's also quite a security concern. What if you were running a command that inadvertently deleted something or something along those lines? So as a result, we have this global flag which is delivered as true to allow operating system level executions of commands as part of automations and checks. If you're using the full power of Avantra and you want to go down the route of doing automations, which let's face it, everybody does, you're going to leave this set to true. But in that scenario, I highly recommend restricting the agent user to only run commands that it should be allowed to run. So for example, let's say I have an Ubuntu system and I am running my agent on the Ubuntu system and I want to have an automation that runs weekly that will automatically patch that system using the apt-get update command. I will add my Avantra agent user to the sudoers file to only run sudo apt-get update -y or upgrade -y, for example, if I want to do that. So I will allow that Avantra agent OS user to execute privileged commands, but only whitelisting them, rather than giving, for example, access to the sudoers group or something along those lines. So that is the correct mitigation for this. But if you truly need and don't want to go down the route of having any sort of OS level executions, you can set this one to false. Similarly, with the second one I mentioned, run.js allow db write. This is disabling the ability to write or to execute SQL queries on databases that could have that actually could change something in the database. So it might be an insert, it could be an update, or it could be a delete. So having that disabled or enabled will allow or deny the ability to run those types of queries. The final one I want to show you here in the Avantra master server is this web HTTP server. So the master server itself has its own administration web console on the port 9058 by default. This is not something you usually log into. In fact, typically we see customers using it only as part of a debug or as part of a support case where we're trying to figure out, hey, how's your memory usage? Show us all the information about how your Avantra system is running and all this kind of fun stuff. By default, we deliver it as enabled because it's very useful and it is secured via username and password. But in a hardened environment, unless you need it, we recommend disabling it. You can always re-enable it if you open a support case and we need some extra information. But by default, I would recommend switching web.http server to off. This will have no impact on the web UI that we're looking at right now. It is purely what we call the administration and statistics web page, which is delivered from the master server, not from the UI server. Couple of other things I would want to show. Let's pop over to the Evantra UI. There's the log level on the UI side should also be set to error, as we saw earlier. But those two items I called out on the main web page, on the login page, I should say, the remember me and the reset password, you can see here I've set them to no. So that's a recommendation we would make as well in terms of setting up your system. If you have an identity provider configured, then you don't need the remember me and the reset password buttons to be available. It's just good practice to not allow those if you don't need them. And finally, UI master protocol. So we changed it at the master side to accept A5S, and now we update the UI itself to use A5S as well. So that's the secure HTTPS version. The last couple of things I'll point out. Password policy. If you are using local users, we really recommend you have a look at the password policy. Make sure it matches your own corporate requirements for passworded systems. And as you can see, there's lots of options here from preventing old passwords, can't contain their own username in the password, and all this kind of fun stuff. And the final thing I want to draw attention to, delivered switched on as standard, is the logbook. And this is where Avantra keeps a log of what people are doing in the system. And this is very useful for audit purposes or for figuring out what happened in specific scenarios. You can see it under Administration, Logbook. And for example, you'll see here in a moment, you see that I've logged in, logged out, logged in, logged out, changed a few properties, etc., etc. And all of this is catalogued, exportable, and reviewable, of course, on your system. So that's pretty much it from a kind of a within the system configuration. There are a few more here that I would recommend that you have a look at here. For example, what to do with multiple failed logon attempts. We've covered most of this. Oh, there is probably one I would mention, which is that everything we have in our hardening guide should be in addition to your operating system hardening guide. So for example, SUSE, Red Hat, Windows, they all provide recommendations on how to harden the actual operating system itself, from stuff like SE Linux, Audit-D, all those kind of really useful additions to your operating system to really keep an eye on what's happening there. Everything we're recommending is in addition to those. So really do pay attention to those hardening guides from your operating system provider and then do these on top of that, and then you'll be in really good shape. What we didn't want to do is to try and copy parts of their guides or to tell you what parts of their guides to implement. Look, they should be independent. Just do them one after another, and I think you'll be in a very good position. So the second thing I want to talk about here is the network communication itself. So one of the recommendations we would make in a hardened environment is to restrict the inbound and outbound access from the server itself. So the first recommendation we make around network is restricting the Avantra master server access to the internet. Now, there are very predictable scenarios where the Avantra services would require outbound access to the internet. The first one is to our activation servers. You have to reactivate your license every few days. So access to api.avantra.com over a secure port is a must. For older installations, there are older versions of that URL around Syslink Xandria. And if you need clarification on which one your license is using, just contact support. It's not a problem. If you integrate with ServiceNow, you need to be able to contact star.servicenow.com. You could even lock that down further if you're aware of the name of the ServiceNow tenant that you're currently using. You don't have to go for a wildcard there if you don't need to. If you're integrating with the cloud provider, GCP, AWS, Azure, SAP, there's going to be outbound communications to their API endpoints, which can vary based on region. So we've done wildcard here as a standard. What you could do here, and what we've seen done to great effect before, is, do some logging. So set up your integrations, get them working, do some logging on the network side, figure out where it's communicating to, validate those endpoints, and then lock it down so that it can only use those endpoints. So that's a great way of achieving this. We do have notifications to our mobile app if you're using it, and we use Firebase for that. So there's a number of Google API endpoints which are used as part of that. But again, good to log those as they happen and then add them to an allow list rather than trying to guess what they are. And then if you have other third-party API endpoints, because Avantra is a tremendously flexible platform. You can output to REST services, you can do SOAP services, whatever you want. And so if you have endpoints that you're reaching out to, you need to make sure that they're covered as well. Next, incoming network connections. So again, there's a predictable number of incoming network connection requests that should be happening to your Avantra server. If you've SSH enabled, guess what? You're going to want to open port 22. But for the actual Avantra services themselves, you're talking about agent communications, which typically come in on TCP port 9050. The web user interface, the one we just looked at here, that's this web interface. Guess what? That's going to come in on the port you define. So in my case, I usually go for 8443. And then the final one to think about is, at times you may have third-party systems that want to access the APIs of Avantra. Now, Avantra has two API endpoints. We have a SOAP service and we have a GraphQL REST API endpoint, as you can see here. And so you may want to allow inbound connectivity. Again, it would be on 8443 to those endpoints. The GraphQL APIs are also used to power our mobile app. So if that needs to be accessible from the internet, we have a knowledge base article. So I'll show you where that is. If I scroll up to the top and I say, let's just turn to GraphQL. So Avantra mobile app via VPN, reverse proxy or firewall. This is a very useful guide for how to set up a reverse proxy and where to set it up to for accessing these API endpoints. And the same is true for accessing the SOAP service. Now you might ask, well, okay, mobile app and GraphQL, that makes a lot of sense. Why would I expose the SOAP service? Maybe, for example, you might want your ServiceNow installation to be able to trigger automations within your Avantra installation, and it would do that via the SOAP API. So if you need for external systems to have access to your Avantra API endpoints, we recommend putting them behind a reverse proxy and only expose the paths that need to be exposed for those specific scenarios. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in today's session. You have access to the Avantra hardening guide within your Avantra support portal, support.avantra.com. If you don't yet have an account to access that, please just email us at support@avantra.com and we'll get you access, no problem. Please do bookmark it and Put a reminder in your calendar, review it every 3-6 months, just to make sure that if there's any changes or any recommendations we're making, you get advance notice of those. And yeah, happy coding and happy playing with your Avantra system. That's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.